In San Jose, California, there's a museum on Park Avenue that is worth visiting if you ever happen to be in the area. The Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum holds the largest collection of ancient Egyptian artifacts in Western North America. Inside, you'll find some of the most amazing sights, all significant parts of world history. From statues and hieroglyphs to mummies, household goods to clothing, papyrus documents, and more, the museum holds many sights that many people in the world will never see or even know existed. I had the opportunity to visit this museum shortly after I left the message. At the time, I didn't fully appreciate the priceless value that these artifacts represent. Each artifact, each individual piece of history, tells 1,000 stories. They tell us how the ancient world lived, what the ancient world thought, and how the ancient civilizations progressed. The lessons they learned are passed down through time, all preserved for us to see. The museum displayed a full-scale replica of the Rosetta Stone, a large stele used to translate the Egyptian hieroglyphs and Demotic scripts into ancient Greek, which enabled modern translators to interpret the Egyptian hieroglyphs, a language that would have otherwise been lost to time. Large granite and stone tablets were meticulously carved with images of pharaohs, sphinx, hundreds of other hieroglyphs depicted as Egyptians under the warm rays flowing from the sun god Ra. It was very easy to compare the belief system of the ancient Egyptians to the message religion that I had left. The prophet believed that the first Bible was the zodiac, and that the second Bible was the pyramid. The Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza specifically. This unusual theology would have been strange to other Christians, but for the ancient Egyptians, it would have been readily accepted. As I studied each exhibit, I found it hard to believe that message believers were so uninterested in Egyptian history. If the Great Pyramid was a Bible, shouldn't we have tried to know more about it, and its relation to the zodiac, astronomy, and astrology? The message focused heavily on faith healing. The prophet was known as a faith healer and was one of the leaders of the post-World War II healing revival. Shouldn't the first and second Bible tell us more about faith healing? Wouldn't understanding the ancient culture tell us more about those two Bibles? In Egyptian mythology, Isis was the goddess of healing. Historians believe that worshippers of Isis rarely prayed to her for healing, however. Instead, they believed in her kindness and willingness to answer those who needed healing. The average age of death in ancient Egypt was 19 years old. Yet the ancients never questioned the effectiveness of Isis or their faith healing. Even with high rates of infant mortality and premature death, they believed that Isis improved their chances of healing. This is an idea that I never really thought about. The grave sites in Jeffersonville are filled with people who placed their faith in the prophet for healing. Those diagnosed with terminal illness who recovered all believed that their chances were better because of the prophet. Those who died went to their graves thinking their faith was not as strong as it should have been, never questioning the prophet or his power to heal. Instead, they questioned their own faith. The prophet taught that if you weren't healed after he pronounced, "Thus saith the Lord," it was your faith at fault. I always wondered where the doctrine came from. As much as I searched, I never could find anything even remotely similar to it in the Bible. The sick had faith in God for their healing, not any prophet. And when God declared healing, he never tied his healings to the results of the faith of the person who was healed. Once I learned that the prophet started the Voice of Healing publication to promote his ministry, I searched to find several early issues. Fortunately, they were available in an online archive. Searching through them, I found similar articles in several of the issues describing why all are not healed. Even the very first issue had this disclaimer for those who were not healed in the prophet's recent campaigns. That article was written by Reverend Fred Francis Bosworth. This was a name that I was familiar with in the message. The prophet mentioned Reverend Bosworth 568 times on the recorded sermons that we had access to hear, the earliest in 1947. I found something strange in the very first recording that is available. The first words are, "We're getting some new gadgets for recording." I had never noticed this sentence when I was a believer in the message, yet it was the very first sentence of the very first transcript of the earliest sermon that we could access. It was evident from the quality of later sermons that they did purchase new recording equipment. But why would the prophet announce new equipment on his first recording? Certainly, he didn't start his ministry with gadgets he intended to immediately replace. How many years in the past was the announcement of the old gadgets for recording? I wanted to know more about the prophet's ministry that we no longer had access to see or hear, and I was curious about F.F. Bosworth, who played such a significant part in the prophet's ministry. What made him decide to tour the world with the prophet? How was he so deeply involved, yet never joined the message? I came across something interesting while searching the Ku Klux Klan activities at the Cadle Tabernacle as I researched E. Howard Cadle and Ed Jackson. Shortly after the Klan started their campaigns to take control of Indiana government, Fred Francis Bosworth announced his plan for a religious campaign in Indianapolis. I knew that this was not enough to tie him directly to the white supremacy group, but I also knew that they would not have invited him if his views did not align with theirs. It was also highly unlikely that he would have accepted their invitation if his views did not align with theirs. The Ku Klux Klan activities in Indianapolis had made national news for the recent invasion of Indianapolis government. I found it interesting that Bosworth was recognized in the article for pastoring the Gospel Tabernacle in Dallas, Texas, and that it was the same time Reverend Roy E. Davis was a pastor in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Like the prophet, F.F. Bosworth was a nationally recognized faith healer. From the newspaper articles, I found it was clear that the Bosworth Brothers campaigns attracted big crowds from coast to coast. During the time Roy Davis began his evangelistic career in Texas, the Bosworth Brothers began their healing revivals. F.F. Bosworth was one of the early founders of the Assemblies of God sect of Pentecostalism, a Pentecostal sect that promoted the exclusion of African Americans from the highest levels. After the Church of God sect of Pentecostalism split to form the Assemblies of God, some Church of God churches became predominantly black, while the assemblies became predominantly white. This segregation would have been popular with both Roy Davis and the leaders of the Cadle Tabernacle, and I was surprised to see that Bosworth himself was a big name in the denomination during its formation and until 1916. I was also surprised to learn that David Duplessis, another one of William Branham's associates, was also part of the organization. Still, this was not the most startling information to be found about Reverend F.F. Bosworth. Faith healing was not new to F.F. Bosworth when he and his brother began their faith healing campaigns. Before starting the Assemblies of God, Bosworth was a member of a strange healing cult that was located just north of Chicago, yet another tie to the Chicago area. Bosworth was a ranking member of faith healer John Alexander Dowie's religious commune, which started in the Chicago area and moved to Zion, Illinois. Dowie was a name I was also familiar with. The prophet preached to the Zion cult following and claimed that Dowie himself had prophesied about the prophet's ministry. He said, how Dr. Dowie in his death prophesied that I would come to that city 40 years from the time that he died. Not knowing anything about it, he died on one day and I was born on the next. And 40 years to the day I entered the city, not knowing anything about it. Oh, how God's great move is coming together. I hear the sound of abundance of rain. It is difficult to say whether the prophet first came in contact with Dowie's religious doctrine through his connection to F.F. Bosworth or Roy Davis, but it was clear from the prophet's statements that he respected John Alexander Dowie as a prophet and had respect for the religious cult that Dowie had established. I suddenly realized that through F.F. Bosworth, there were multiple connections being established between the prophet and Chicago. While E. Howard Cadle was building his gambling empire in Chicago, John Alexander Dowie was building a political and religious empire. His following grew to such a population that they outgrew Chicago. Dowie purchased land north of the city that would eventually become known as Zion, Illinois. Zion City, a religious cult commune, was fully controlled by John Alexander Dowie. It had its own government, utilities, distribution, retail, and more, with Dowie holding supreme authority. During this time, F.F. Bosworth was the band director for the city, its religious activities, and its evangelistic outreach program. Dowie's followers believed him to be the return of Elijah the prophet from the Old Testament. The nation recognized him as a mentally unstable faith healer titled "The Richest Man in the West," but Chicago recognized him as a political threat. As F.F. Bosworth toured the city with Dowie, whose nickname was quickly becoming Elijah III, Dowie pushed his agenda like a Chicago mob boss. In a meeting at Madison Square Garden in New York City, Dowie threatened New York City officials. He boasted that he had gained political control of Chicago, and that he was able to sway 50,000 political votes, and that he would soon have control of New York City. At the height of his wealth and power, John Alexander Dowie had accumulated $15 million, which was over $425 million in today's money. According to the newspapers, Dowie had built his $500,000, in today's money, empire in just 10 years, simply by promoting himself as a biblical Elijah faith healer. At first, I wondered why F.F. Bosworth would switch from believing Dowie's Elijah to Branham's Elijah, but then a much more disturbing thought struck me. Had Roy E. Davis and other Klan leaders realized that religion could be weaponized to sway politics? Shortly before Roy E. Davis moved his base of operations to Louisville from Tennessee, F.F. Bosworth faced a very devastating, highly publicized failure in his faith-healing campaigns. A man that Bosworth claimed to be cured had died of the same disease that brought him to the healing campaigns. According to his widow, the victim did not die for lack of faith. The victim was very faithful. Bosworth's only response to the newspaper was, in my opinion, a poor defense. He insinuated that the man could have been cured of one disease and died of another. Bosworth went on to tell the news media of a previous failure wherein a deaf man was healed but failed to hear. According to Bosworth, the Spirit told him to avoid tobacco, and when the man did not listen to the Spirit, his deafness returned. Reminded of the Egyptians and ISIS, I began to wonder, was Bosworth's God so powerless that he didn't realize the man had two illnesses? Did this God not have the power to both heal and to take away the sin? Suddenly, I began to understand why Bosworth published unhealed disclaimers in the prophet's newsletter. He was familiar with the angry mobs that grew from a failed healing. Seeing the political and financial power of the men involved with the prophet's ministry changed the way that I viewed his meetings. Up to this point, I only thought of the message as a religion. I never considered its political power or the amount of money that flowed through those meetings. Even early in my research, I had discovered a handful of people that the prophet had healed who still died. Thinking about the crowds of people that filled auditoriums to see the healers, and how they must have been viewed by Cadle, Bosworth, Dowie, Davis, and other big names in the healing revival, my stomach began to churn. These were not faithful. They were assets to persuade, influence, control, and financially deplete. Did the prophet view them in the same way? It was time to focus my attention once again to the prophet's early ministry, and more closely examine his personal lifestyle. I'd already learned that the prophet was not nearly so poor as he often described, but I also did not see any signs of an abundance of wealth during his early years. I decided that there were only three possibilities. One, either the prophet was so fully devoted to his spiritual beliefs that he decided to mass persuade others to also devote themselves, or two, the prophet was seeking wealth or power, or worse, or three, other men were using the prophet for their own wealth, power, and strategic purpose. I knew the first option would be easy to prove or disprove. If the prophet were fully devoted, that devotion would be manifested in his life off stage. The stage persona would match the person. I had already exhausted most of my resources for learning the prophet's personal life directly, and they seemed as one might expect. They were his own descriptions of himself, using his own advertisements, titles, and subject matter that he himself created and gave to newspapers. For a minister, his early life was simply ministry. If I was going to gain any insight into his life off stage, I knew that I would need to begin by examining people in his inner circle who were not in the public eye or part of the stage act. I knew that the best place to start was with the prophet's immediate family, those who did not travel with him in his evangelistic career.